Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read about Edgar Allan Poe. Poe and the American Reality. There can be no doubt that between 1835 and 1842, at least, Poe's attention to British presidents and the dictates of his own particular literary gifts demonstrated a defective sense of reality. He may well have felt his own talents to be admirably suited to the type of literary journalism still extant in Europe. By around him, it was a new society which was feeling the need to develop its own journalistic modes. The American situation. American magazines on the British pattern were not likely to flourish in the American situation for a variety of reasons. In the first place, as Margaret Fuller said, there was not a great deal of wit and light talent in the country of the kind of journalism required. Poe was exceptional, even unique, in his flexibility and range of his writing. Other American journalists were either more solemn or more easily and simply sentimental. Furthermore, a good magazine of the European kind was bound to cost $5 per annum, and it had to compete with the same ground with the eclectic journals which pirated the British material and with the American reprints of the British journals which sold at the club rate of $5 or $10 per annum. In face of this competition, it is not surprising that the old-style American magazines could rarely pay their contributors, or that the usual history of the American magazines in the European patterns in the early 19th century was, in the New York Mirror's words, to put forth their young green leaves in the shape of promises and prospectuses, blossom through a few numbers, and then perish because of bills and dues and debts unpaid. The average age of the new periodicals in the country, added the Mirror, is about to be 6 months. Inevitably, a new kind of magazine was establishing itself in response to the American situation. Establishing itself, as Hervey Allen says, when Poe was beginning his journalistic career, a new journalism, moralistic, democratic, and namby-pamby, was challenging the dominance of the more robust, though stuffer, classically minded literature of the old school. This great wave of the 19th century journalism, which Poe found himself contemporary, looked for its audience to the great widening circle of those reaching the middle classes during economic expansion and made literate by the new system of public education. On a technological level, the increasingly widespread use of stereotyping since its introduction in America was made possible, the low price, large circulation form which prevailed with such journalists ever since. All the essential elements of the new journalism were visible in the magazine, like Godey's Lady's Book, an advertisement for Godey's, which appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, although claiming to show the subscriber what amount of reading and how many embellishments she will receive for $3, giving most of its attention to the embellishments. The coloring of the fashion plates, we say nothing of the flowers and cottages, cost us over $2,000 for 1 year. To admit this is certainly a savings, but it is just to the subscribers. Is it honorable? We cannot practice such a deception. This is crude by modern standards, but the kind of ethos evoked is very familiar. Popular literary articles and tales were packaged in a modern way with material of the most kind of the consumers wanted: sentimental love tales, gossip, receipts, popular songs, and fashion news and plates, and the latter material guaranteed the circulation. Thus, there is a certain amount of educational material with strong feminine bias, influence of females or female education or mothers of Christian teachers, the latest by the popular Miss Sigourney, and other intellectual material to very small in bulk. One gets from time to time a half page in Talleyrand, Virgil's tomb, or illustrations of mythology. Literary portraits of the well-known writers, Moore and Campbell, Monk, Lewis, and Shelley, are occasionally introduced to a page, but the tone of educational articles is carefully adapted to its audience. Our fair readers proclaims an article in the meteoric shower need not be under any serious apprehensions of alarm. We are not going to explore the mysterious depths of science, and the vast bulk of the magazine's material has no pretensions of any kind of serious significance and consists overwhelmingly of sentimental love stories, varied with the occasional crime story. There is little fiction which, like Pope's The Visionary, clearly appeals to a higher intellectual level than the rest of the magazine. There are from time to time overtly literary contributions, a tragedy called Orman Grossesnor, allegories like The Genius and Feeling and Allegory, which may add tone to the magazine but are basically as conventionally sentimental as the staple fiction. In the 30s, there was often a cheapness of appearance and vulgarity of tone, which disappears with the greater confidence and affluence of the later issues, but the formula remains on the whole remarkably consistent. There is no doubt partly because the forces which standardized the modern mass circulation magazine and contents were rapidly coming into operation. William Cheravat, in his book Literary Publishing in America, describes how sensitive the newly styled editors of Godet and Graham were to the taste of the hinterland, and they accepted and encountered writers who could satisfy it, and how the mass circulation of their journals from centers like Philadelphia and New York gradually homogenized the taste of the South and West. Another factor in the process was the activity of the magazine agencies, which tended to encourage the mass circulation journals at the expense of the others. F.W. Thomas told Poe in a letter in 1840 that the local agencies merely arranged subscriptions for the higher priced journals, but if the publication can be put low enough by the publishers, they will order so many copies on their own account each month. It was magazines like Godet's which had hit on a successful formula to meet the American situation. The South and Poe's early literary elitism. Poe's initial resistance to this tendency is easy to explain. Enough has been made by biographers and critics of the significance of Poe's Southern upbringing for the roots of his early attitude to be clear. Poe became to his first magazine the Southern Literary Messenger after growing up in a South that was extended an aristocratic code from the original Virginia gentry to the whole region to consolidate it against Northern pretensions. This process was considerably assisted by British literary and cultural sources and British conservative attitudes to the many and to the trade of writing fitted well into the milieu of cultural conservatism. British J.B. Hubble points out that the conservatives' view of himself as a gentleman, not a writer, was very similar to the Southern gentlemanly attitude. W.J. Cash more bluntly makes it clear that the Southern attitude was strongly influenced by the British gentlemanly style of Steve Sheridan and Fox, with inspirations to be a writer in this social milieu. Poe could hardly fail to distrust the mass audience and the trade of writing to the display, at least initially, elitist attitudes to literature. Scott, Byron, and Moore, more gentlemanly than Wadsworth or Coleridge, were the favorite writers in the South, and it was from their works that the South as a whole was absorbing its vague aristocratic principles. But as we have seen, when Byron actually formulated his socio-literature attitudes, we saw that the status of the writers and their relation to the mass audience in more ambivalent terms than did gentlemanly 18th century writers, and Scott showed a similar uncertainty. He may have made derogatory remarks about his popular poetry, but may have seen fiction as having little value compared to the real history and useful literature. But he also claimed that the most popular writing of an age could be equally well received by posterity. In public, he may have lived a gay, gentlemanly life, which seemed to preclude work. But in his journal, he discussed the management and profit of his propriety, the Waverley novels, and with bluff commercials, acumen, quality, popularity, a balanced acceptance of both the few and the many, made it difficult for Byron and Scott to remain completely and traditionally elitist attitudes. Moore, it is true, deploring the lowering of the standard that must necessarily arise from the extending of the circle of judges, from letting the mob in to vote, particularly at the period when the market is such an object to authors, Those who live to please, he said, must please to live, and most will write down to the lowered standard. But for British expressions of the really thoroughgoing elitist position of the 1830s, one has to go to a few strongly conservative writers, for example, Sir Egerton Beiges and his vile evil wrote Beiges, that literature has become so much of a trade all over Europe. For him, what is called the spread of literature is a very doubtful good. He claimed merit is now universally established by the multitude of readers that an author can attract. The corruption, prejudice, selfishness, and ignorance of the mass audience was one reason for this. The other was the deliberate conspiracy between those writers who manufactured popular books to suit the transient curiosity of the public for the day, and who was reviewed then to gain an opportunity of expressing their own opinions in the magazines. Such views were practically extinct in Britain by 1830s, and at least as far as writers for the magazine were concerned, the susceptibilities of the many as well as the few had to be considered. As a young man of aristocratic leisure and expectations, Bulwer shared Sir Egerton's view of popularity. Later, as a successful novelist and journalist, he asserted that the really popular literature cannot appeal to vulgar and unworthy passions. The New Monthly is an article in one of Bridges' books in 1826, claiming with some justice that his extremely conservative view of the literary situation would be unacceptable to Whig and Tory alike. But such views were still viable in the magazines of the American South as weapons against Northern literary mercantilism in the hands of Southern gentlemen. American authorship, declares a writer in the Southern Quarterly Review for April 1853, as fast becoming a trade, and American literary endeavors lack proper motive. Its appeal is too low. It does not seek the adequate tribunal. It works only for the present, which is a fatal error, and it works for money. It is simply a trade among us looking to market profits and pecuniary recompense. In the South, the more conservative British literary attitudes were preserved in an almost fossilized state as the contribution to the region's self-differentiation, and it was in the heart of the Old South in Richmond, Virginia, that Poe began to write. Like the young Bulwer or the young John Wilson, he cultivated as a young man the role of the poet and gentleman in his Southern context, and he was not in the first instances of a journalist at all, preferring to play the traditional role. He is at work upon a tragedy, but I have turned him into drudging upon whatever makes money, wrote Kennedy with the poverty-stricken young man who had made such courteous apologies for being unequipped to dine with him. And in some moods, Poe remained the poetic manqué throughout his life. Events not to be controlled, he wrote in the preface of his 1845 volume of poems, have prevented me from making at any time any serious effort in what, under happier circumstances, would have been a field of my choice. Bulwer had also inclined towards poetry in his youth, and in the preface of his poem, The Siamese Twins, refers patriotically to the other works in humbler prose. Incenses in both writers were a hint of distrust of the mass audience, reflecting in both, no doubt, the youthful literary ideals of the period before they were forced to earn a living. But there can be no doubt that Poe's gentlemanly prose in the context of the aspiring Richmond middle class of the time would be a good deal more self-consciously contrived than that of the British writers like Bulwer, who were his first models. This is a result of the whole Southern milieu that one finds in Poe's earliest journalism. So many declarations of what the 1830s was an archaic elitism, even by British standards. This sense of his own role in journalism might be suggested in his words in The Messenger in May 1836. How absolute is the necessity now daily growing of rescuing our stage criticism from the control of illiterate mountebanks and placing it in the hands of gentlemen and scholars. According to his own account, it was in this period that he was first formulated the plan for his own literary magazine, The Stylist, which was to embody his literary ideals and appear in an upper-class audience, drawn largely from the South. In his earliest references to the audience in the Southern Literary Messenger and Graham's Magazine were often extremely conservative and elitist, even in the comparison with the European journals of the time, entirely accepting the subordination of the many to the few. He prophesied that the none but the les vulgaires would ever think of getting through with a book called Confessions of a Poet, and that birds, the hawks of the Hawk Hollow, while it may add to the author's popularity, will not at all advance among men whose decisions are entitled to consideration, advance the high opinion previously entertained of his abilities. In denying J.P.R. James's popularity, he did not mean, he said, to imply that he was highly estimated by the few. He has fallen apparently upon the unlucky mediocrity permitted neither by gods nor columns. He agreed that the literary success may result from a sympathy between the mediocrity of the writer's ideas and the mediocrity of those of public works, which the mass audience was capable of reading. He claimed did not involve thought and were not literature. Dickens might be thought of to offer an example of a writer who could be good and popular, but in fact, said Poe, Dickens was too good a writer to achieve the greatest popularity. And like Sir Egerton, Poe adopted the conspiratorial theory of audience. He explained the reputation achieved by popular works as being the result of the chicanery of the small writer who knows how to exploit the influence of the reviewers and of the puffery whereby members of the clique advanced each other's works into the public eye, as well as the vulgarity of the mass audience, the principles according to which Poe's reputation in some moods, the same popular elements of the Blackwoods type of journalism are clearly visible in these early reviews. We're going to leave it here for tomorrow. We'll talk about elitism as a deference of failure and on about Poe's critiques. So if you think there's any truth and like to what I'm saying here, please like and enjoy and subscribe, and God bless the children.